Hi, welcome to the second video for J3. We are talking about social validity. So what is social validity? I would say, and I just made up this definition, that they're values-based judgments about what's important, and those judgments can be sort of globally what's important for humans. They can be sort of centered culturally, what's important for this child given his sort of culture and current contexts, more sort of locally, what's important for this kid based on what's going on in his home and school environments, and also individually, what's important to this child or this family. So I think it's interesting to think about social validity because of the values-based components, right? So social validity is like a little bit messier than other dependent variables that we think about in single case design because it's really values-based, and we all know that we don't all have the exact same values. So when thinking about social validity, it's sort of important to decenter yourself from your research and center the kid, his family, his culture, his contexts, because essentially the question that you're asking is how important is your research? And that's not a question that you can answer. So typically we think about goals, procedures, and outcomes when we think about social validity. So do people, either stakeholders or, distal or proximal stakeholders, think that the goals that you're setting are important, that the procedures that you're using are acceptable, and that the outcomes that you get are meaningful. So typically for social validity, we do questionnaires that we give to parents or other adults when we're finished with the intervention, and we say, did you like my intervention? And sort of invariably, they reply yes, which is quite unsurprising. So if you think about somebody coming to do something that was helpful to you, they intended it to be helpful, and they're done and leaving, and they ask you, was I helpful? Think about the likelihood that you would answer no to that question. It's pretty low, but it's also pretty meaningless. So in general, I think the how much did you like this intervention kinds of questions aren't super helpful. That's not to say that I don't think that asking consumers about the research once it's over isn't helpful. There are certain kinds of questions that certainly are helpful, like, what do you think I could do different next time, right? Those kinds of questions might elicit responses from adults that might allow you to improve your upcoming research, right? But asking whether they liked it or not is typically, it's sort of expected, but also I think it's not super helpful. So I don't think it's harmful to do this. So if it makes a reviewer happy, maybe we should do it. But I also don't think it gives us any more information, unless we're doing sort of a really controversial intervention and we really want to get some information about whether it's acceptable. Whether or not a constant time delay intervention is acceptable to a teacher is pretty uninteresting. And that's especially true in single case research because we tend to have such repeated measures, right? So when I go in and I do an intervention for 30 school days in a row with this kid, and I'm clearly invested in their outcomes, a teacher is certainly not going to tell me that she thinks my intervention is stupid. So, so I think that those kinds of measures aren't super helpful in terms of getting information. So if that's true, then what do I think we should do? I think pre-intervention questionnaires could be quite helpful. So depending on what your research interests are, you should ask parents, teachers, and children what they need, what they value, what they want you to do, to the extent that you can, you should give them choices about how you're going to do the intervention and what you're going to intervene on. So even if, say, you have a research project and it's related to challenging behavior. So if the parents self-identified as needing help with this, that's the first step, right? So you've identified that they value this potential service that you have. But also you can still ask them what they value and what they need, right? So for some families, that might look like they value reduction of challenging behavior in this one specific context where they have a really hard time, or this one specific behavior that's really problematic for their family. So just recruiting information before you start and being open to ways that you can listen to your participants and other stakeholders to modify your interventions, I think is really important. So we talked about this a little bit on the first day, but also participant choice. So within your intervention, you should always give participants choices just because that's a good practice for children. But also I think when it's possible, you should ask children about their preferences for being in the intervention condition. So when you use ATD and AATD designs, this is really easy. I talked about that on Monday, I think. But when you use other designs, you could also do it sort of after the fact, right? So the kid has experienced a baseline condition and they've experienced an intervention condition, and essentially your question is like, would you rather do the intervention with me or go do this other thing, right? And it's not always awful if the kid doesn't choose the intervention with you, but it does provide some information. And I think I've talked a little bit about peer-mediated intervention, but I think this is especially critical for when we involve peers in intervention, right? So when we involve peers, is it something that they would choose to do if they didn't have to? That's important information because it relates to how feasible and maintainable these interventions are once we leave. So normative comparisons are fine. I don't often love them for sort of determining to what extent participants get to some normal level of behavior. I do think that they're sometimes helpful because they often help show us how variable and imperfect the behavior of typically developing children are. So oftentimes when we collect normative comparison data, we see that engagement and challenging behavior for the kid who's sort of identified as the typical, like middle of the range child in the class, it's often fairly variable and certainly not 0% challenging behavior and 100% engagement. So I like normative comparison data, that is collecting data on sort of a child identified as close to the average, because I think that it reminds us that children's behavior are variable and imperfect, and I like to have that comparison when we're trying to improve the behavior of children with disabilities. I think naive raters is a really excellent way to assess the effects of intervention. So essentially, you ask people who are unaware of your study purpose or the conditions to rate something about the intervention. So, for example, you could ask them about the affect of the child. Does the child seem to be having fun? And these are the kinds of things that I think provide evidence. Again, it's about like, is this something that's going to be able to be continued outside of a research study, and should it be continued, right? So I think that it's helpful to sort of ask people who don't have any skin in the game and who don't really understand what you're doing, whether there are differences in conditions and the extent to which those differences are positive. A few people so far that we've talked to the past 2 days have either mentioned mixed methods or talked about mixed methods without calling it that. But I think that the best thing that we can do as single case researchers is to make friends with qualitative researchers who can help us establish qualitative methods for assessing social validity. And I think that if we're really interested in improving the acceptability of our interventions, we really need qualitative expertise to be able to do that. So I have I think Angel said that she sort of uses mixed methods almost all the time, qualitative and quantitative together. And I think it's not a bad idea. I think that using qualitative data to inform social validity is a really good idea, and it's a good fit with single case research. So qualitative and single case research are really, I think, sort of an ideal fit with quantitative data from the single case portion and qualitative data related to social validity. All right, this was a short one. So conclusions, you should figure out what kinds of social validity questions you have, and then figure out what way you could measure something in a way that's less likely to be biased than those post questionnaires, and do that. So I think that if you do a post questionnaire, I'm not opposed to that. But if you have serious social validity questions, that shouldn't be your only measure. And that is all I have. If you have questions, send them to me in Google Forms, and I will see you tomorrow.